It was 1976, just outside Memphis. Halfway through Can't Help Falling in Love, Elvis stopped. A woman in the front row clutched a torn cardboard sign. Her dress was threadbare, her eyes wet but unblinking locked on his. The King set down the mic. This is the night Elvis Presley did something no spotlight could capture. Stay with me, because the ending, what happened after that show, might be the most moving act of kindness you've never heard. The first thing people remember isn't the song, it's the pause. Elvis Presley was halfway through Can't Help Falling in Love when his right hand lifted palm open. The band froze mid-chord. A hush rolled through the arena, swallowing the final echo from the amps. For a beat, no one moved. The air felt thick, the way it does just before a storm. Spotlights searched the first rows, dust motes floating in the beams. The smell of buttered popcorn mixed with the bite of cigarette smoke. Somewhere in the upper decks, a soda cup hit the floor and rolled, the hollow sound carrying in the silence. And then he saw her, front row, small frame, shoulders hunched as if the weight of her own sign was too much. Torn cardboard, black marker, in shaky block letters, Army widows saved for months to see you. Witnesses say she clutched something else in her lap, a worn, folded photograph of a young soldier in uniform. She never took her eyes off him. Elvis adjusted the mic stand, leaned forward. His white jumpsuit caught every glint from the overhead lights. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just nodded to the security guard by the stage steps. The guard bent down, spoke to her. She shook her head at first, then allowed herself to be guided to the edge of the stage. Elvis stepped down, boots hitting the floor with a dull thud. The crowd murmured, a low ripple, unsure whether to cheer or stay quiet. When he reached her, he bent to one knee, close enough now to see the deep creases in her dress, the frayed hem. Her hands trembled as she touched the end of his scarf, bright red against the muted grey of her outfit. They spoke. No one could hear over the faint hum of the PA system, but she nodded once, then twice. From the stage, the backup singers watched, mics at their sides. The drummer twirled a stick in slow circles, waiting. Elvis stood, glanced back at the band, then locked eyes with her again. Something unspoken passed between them, something heavy enough that the people in the back rows leaned forward in their seats without knowing why, and then, with barely emotion, he lifted two fingers toward the wings, the signal he used when he wanted something handled quietly, off schedule. Joe Esposito, his road manager, caught the gesture from across the stage and started moving. Nobody knew what it meant. Not the band, not the fans, not even the woman clutching that folded photograph. But in less than 10 minutes, it would set in motion one of the most unexpected nights of her life. The roar of the crowd faded into the muffled thump of bass through cinder block walls. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold glow on the narrow backstage corridor. The air was thick with cologne, hairspray, and the sweat of a man who had just performed for nearly 2 hours. Elvis walked beside her, not ahead, not leading, matching her slow, deliberate steps. She kept her eyes down, gripping the cardboard, sin in one hand, that folded photograph in the other. A crew member offered her a chair in a small dressing room cluttered with water bottles, scarves, and an untouched plate of fruit. She hesitated before sitting, as if afraid she might not be allowed to stay. "Margaret," Elvis said softly, repeating her name as if trying to lock it in his memory. She was 43, a widow for 6 years. Her husband, an army medic, had been killed. Overseas, since then, she'd raised 2 kids on a small military pension. According to her, most months ended with more bills than dollars. Elvis lowered himself into the chair opposite hers, leaning forward so their knees almost touched. "How'd you get here tonight?" he asked. Margaret's voice was barely louder than the buzz of the lights. "I sold my husband's watch, the one he wore before." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "He loved your music, said it reminded him of home." Through the thin wall came the distant chant of Elvis, Elvis. The crowd, still waiting, still hungry for the encore. Joe Esposito stepped into the doorway, checking his watch. "You've got 10 minutes before we're late on the rap," he said. Elvis didn't look at him. "Give me more than 10, he said, voice calm but firm. Joe nodded once and slipped back into the hallway. Margaret's hands fidgeted with the edge of her sign. The cardboard was soft from being carried all day, bent slightly at the corners. Her shoes' black flats were worn thin at the soles, the leather peeling at the toes. The sound of the audience swelled again, the way it does when people sense something's happening they can't see. Elvis tapped his fingers lightly on the arm of his chair, then reached for the black rotary phone on the table. He dialed without looking, murmured something short, and hung up. Margaret watched him, unsure. If she should ask. He didn't explain, just leaned back, studying her face as if taking a mental photograph. The amp hum from the stage crept into the silence between them. Margaret shifted, the wood of the chair creaking. Finally, Elvis spoke. "Stay close. I'm not done yet." Mid-roll hook. What he did next wasn't in any set list, and it would change her life. The noise from the stage grew louder, stomps, claps, whistles pushing through the thin walls like a wave pressing against glass. Elvis stood, straightened his scarf, and offered his hand to her. She took it, and together they stepped toward the stage entrance. The stage door opened, and the roar hit like a physical force. Margaret flinched at the sudden brightness of the spotlights, her eyes narrowing as Elvis guided her toward center stage. The band was already in position, waiting for his signal. The crowd, thousands of faces, was on its feet. Instead of starting the planned encore, Elvis lifted the mic. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying clear to the rafters, "I want to sing this one for a friend I just met tonight." The first gentle guitar notes of "Love Me Tender" floated out over the arena. Elvis didn't stand tall in the spotlight. He lowered himself, once again, to one knee in front of Margaret. The white of his jumpsuit glowed against the dark stage floor. She stood there, scarf still draped over her shoulders, both hands gripping it like it might vanish if she let go. He began the first verse, eyes never leaving hers. Each word sounded slower, more deliberate, as if he wanted her to hear not just the lyrics, but the space between them. The audience swayed, some with arms around each other, some with tears catching in the glow of camera flashes. A woman in the second row clutched her chest. A man near the aisle lowered his camera, just listening, halfway through the song. Elvis rose to his feet and stepped closer. He extended the microphone toward Margaret. She shook her head at first, but he nodded gently once, twice. Her voice, when it came, was thin and uneven, but it carried through the speakers just the same. The band softened behind her, giving her the moment. The line she sang cracked on the last word, but the crowd erupted into cheers all the same. A flashbulb went off somewhere to the left, capturing the exact moment Elvis leaned in, smiling just enough to crease the corners of his eyes. That photograph would run in the Memphis paper the next morning, a black and white slice of what thousands had witnessed. As the song closed, Elvis pulled her into a brief embrace. The music faded, leaving only the sound of applause washing over them in waves. He lowered his head to her ear, speaking just loud enough for her to hear over the noise. Whatever he said, her eyes widened. Her grip on the scarf tightened. She nodded once, almost too fast, as if agreeing before the words could vanish. From the wings, Joe Esposito was already moving, a look of quiet understanding on his face. The crowd had no idea what had just been set in motion. To them, it was just another Elvis moment, one for the scrapbook. But for Margaret, it was the start of something she wouldn't even believe herself if she didn't live it. The house lights dimmed as the final applause rolled across the arena. By the time the crowd spilled into the warm Tennessee night, Margaret was nowhere near the exits. A security guard guided her through a side corridor that smelled faintly of damp concrete and stage dust. Her shoes scraped the floor with each careful step, the sound oddly loud in the narrow passage. They reached a plain metal door. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of rain on asphalt. A black Cadillac idled at the curb, engine purring. Joe Esposito stood beside it, holding something small in his hand. No fanfare, no explanation. Just a plain white envelope. "This is from Mr. Presley," he said, offering it to her. Margaret looked from Joe to the car, then back to the envelope. She hesitated, fingers hovering before she finally took it. The paper was warm, as if it had just been in someone's pocket. Before she could ask a question, Joe opened the rear door. "Best you head on home now." She stepped back, the Cadillac door shutting with a deep, final thud. In seconds, the car was rolling away, taillights glowing red against the wet street before vanishing into the dark. Under a street lamp, Margaret opened the envelope. Inside, neatly stacked, was cash. New bills, edges crisp. She counted once, then again to be sure. $5,000. In 1976, it was a small fortune. Tucked between the bills was a single folded note, written in bold, unmistakable handwriting. "For you and the kids. E." Her knees softened, and she steadied herself against the pole of the street lamp. For a moment, she thought about chasing after the car, about saying she couldn't take it. But something in that short, handwritten message told her this wasn't charity, was meant as a bridge, something to hold her up until the next shore. Later, neighbors would remember seeing her return home that night. The cardboard sign was gone. The scarf remained, still looped loosely around her shoulders. The envelope was clutched tight in one hand, like it might disappear if she let go. In the days that followed, the money went exactly where it needed to. She hired a man from down the street to patch the roof before the autumn rains came. She enrolled her son in private guitar lessons, something he'd begged for, but she'd always had to decline. The rest covered groceries, school clothes, and a little breathing room in a life that rarely had any. But the story didn't end with the money. Mid-roll hook, because a week later, something even stranger arrived at her door. It came in the late morning, left on the porch without a knock. No return address. No markings except her name, neatly written on brown paper wrapping Margaret carried it inside, her heart thudding in her chest. Whatever was inside was light but solid. She reached for the twine and began to untie it. The paper wrapping came away, in soft tears, the fibers fraying under her fingers. Inside was a black guitar case, the latches slightly tarnished but polished to a shine. Margaret froze, one hand resting on the handle. When she opened it, the smell of fresh varnish drifted out. Nestled in deep red velvet was a guitar, a cherry sunburst finish, the kind that caught light and made it dance. Taped to the strings was a folded note, "For your boy. You'll always have a seat in the front row." Elvis, her son Daniel, was still at school. She sat with the guitar for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to close the case again. When Daniel came home, his reaction was immediate: wide eyes, breathless disbelief. He ran his fingers over the smooth wood like it was something alive. According to him, that guitar became more than just an instrument. It was an anchor. In a neighborhood where trouble found kids faster than opportunity, the guitar gave him something to run toward instead of away from. He practiced until his fingers blistered. By 17, he was playing in church. By his mid-20s, he'd earned a degree in music education. He would later tell students that the guitar in his classroom was a gift from a king. Margaret kept Elvis's scarf and the original note in a small cedar box. She never displayed them, never used the story to draw attention to herself. It was a private treasure, a reminder that even in the hardest years, kindness could walk straight into your life without warning. She passed away in 2012. At her memorial, the scarf rested beside her photo. Daniel played "Love Me Tender" on that same cherry sunburst guitar, his voice cracking but steady enough to carry to the back row. Decades later, Daniel was browsing a flea market in Memphis when he spotted a stack of old concert photographs. Flipping through them, one image made his hands go still. There, in grainy black and white, was his mother Margaret standing in front of Elvis, scarf in hand, both of them caught mid-smile. The seller had no idea who she was. Daniel bought it on the spot. For him, it wasn't just proof of the night. It was the last missing piece of a story he'd been telling for most of his life. Even now, he says the photograph stays framed on his desk, not for visitors, but for himself, because in that frozen moment, the noise of the crowd, the smell of the stage, the weight of a scarful of it still lives. Some stories fade into rumor. This one stayed alive because the proof never disappeared. Tangible objects, witnessed moments, and a son who still plays the same guitar. Long after that August night in 1976, Margaret's story stayed mostly inside the walls of her modest home. She didn't tell it for applause. She didn't share it to impress anyone. Her life remained simple school lunches packed in brown paper bags, bills stacked neatly in a drawer, evenings spent on the porch when the weather was warm. But on the quiet days, when the mail came late and the phone didn't ring, she would open the cedar box. Inside, the red scarf, still faint with the scent of cologne. The folded note, its ink slightly faded, but every letter sharp. And, tucked at the bottom, a worn Polaroid her neighbor had taken of Margaret holding the guitar the day it arrived. Her children grew up hearing the story, but she always told it the same way, brief, direct, never adding details that weren't hers to give. Elvis was kind, she'd say, and he meant it. Years later, when Daniel became a music teacher, he began to share the story with his students. He didn't linger on the fame. He talked about the moment a stranger saw someone hurting and chose to stop everything. By the 1990s, rumors of Elvis's backstage kindnesses had become folklore. Some stories were exaggerated, others lost to memory. But Margaret's had proof. You could touch, handwriting you could compare. For Daniel, that proof mattered. It meant the kindness was real, not a dream colored by grief. In 2012, after Margaret's passing, the scarf and note stayed in the family. The guitar remained in Daniel's classroom, its finish worn where decades of strumming had left their mark. Students ran their fingers over the smooth wood without knowing its history until he told them. One autumn afternoon, a girl in his class stayed after the bell. She asked if she could try playing it. When she finished a shaky version of Love Me Tender, she looked up and said, "I think music feels better when it's shared." Daniel smiled. That's exactly the point. Some acts of generosity last longer than the moment they happen. They ripple through years, shaping lives in ways no one can measure. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who believes. Kindness can change a life. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed a moment of generosity so powerful you couldn't forget it?